Good morning. Today we look at Genesis 18 and 19, and I commented about how many generations we had gone through so quickly in the earlier chapters of Genesis, and now we've come to Abraham, and we learn a lot about Abraham. There's a lot about him in here, and today's reading begins with the Lord appearing to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. And this is where Abraham had settled back in chapter 13. And he had built an altar to the Lord. And this was where he was living. And, you know, in my head, I picture them living in, buildings of some sort. But, it talks about his tent. They were nomads. They didn't build structures all the time. They did, but here, he was in his tent. And even when we get to the New Testament, there were tent makers, and this was their profession, because a lot of people in their nomadic travels would live in tents. In its towns, they had houses and buildings and everything as well, and we find the archaeologists are digging them up every once in a while. But anyway, he's there, and he sees three men, it says, three men standing near him. And he understood somehow that these men were important. And he went and, said, come. And one of them was the Lord. And the other two were angels, as we're going to find out as we read. But Abraham had a meal prepared for them. And Abraham and Sarah, they've had their names changed, as we talked about yesterday. And the one of the men asks Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And they're in the tent. And the one says, "I will return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah will have a son." And Sarah hears this, and it says she laughs. And it's kind of after I've grown old and I no longer, I'm well past childbearing years. As I mentioned, their lives weren't, 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 years old anymore. And so here she is, 90 years old, and she's hearing, she's going to have a baby. She just laughed at that. She said, this is such a joke. But the Lord heard that laughter and asked, "Why did you laugh?" And she denied that she laughed, but he knew. And he says, "Well, the child's name will be Isaac, because Isaac means laughter." And so it just, and it says, and the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I," and then after this, talking about Sarah having this baby, the Lord kind of has a conversation with the other two and wonders, should I hide from Abraham what I'm on my way to do? He's on his way to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Adam's nephew Lot lives there in Sodom and Gomorrah, in that area. And, we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, but as we read it a little bit closer, when Lot is fleeing, the angels, the Lord says, go run to the mountains. And Lot, looks, and it's just Lot and his two daughters. His wife turns and looks back, which they're told not to do. And it says she turns into a pillar of salt. But Lot looks at going off into the mountains as too far a journey. And he says, how about if I just stay in this little community over here? And the Lord agrees to that. And he says, okay, I won't destroy that community as well. So, it wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah, but it was the land around them and maybe other smaller towns as well. But when God and these angels got to Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom, where Lot was staying, Lot recognized them as well and invited them to stay at his house, not out in the middle of the town square, because he knew what would happen. He knew that the men of the town would come and they would, what we would call sodomize these men, and even when the townspeople found out, in the story that I'm sure you're familiar with, they come to Lot's house and they say to him, send out these men so that we may have our way with them. We may get to know them, And Lot says, no, I'm not going to do that. And Lot is standing outside the door talking to him. And he says, how about I bring my daughters out that are virgins, and, but don't do that to these men. And, and what a horrible solution that is too, right? I mean, that's not what's going to be any good. But what happens is these men reach out and pull Lot back in, and they cause the door to be closed so that those outsiders can't get in. So Lot, his girls, and the men are all protected by this, the way I read it anyway. The two angels had come there and they want to have their way with the men. But verse 10 says, the men inside reached out their hands, brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. They struck with blindness the men who were at the door, so that they could not see or find the door. So the way I read that, they're all protected from that, and that horrible, horrible thing did not happen to Lot's daughters. And then the men said to Lot, bring them out in their place. But the angels, asked Lot, who else, we got you, your wife, your daughters here. Is there anyone else? That he says, well, the two men who are going to become my sons-in-law. But the invitation went to them, and but it says it seemed to his sons-in-law that he was joking. They didn't believe him, so they didn't come. And when morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, get up, take your wife, your daughters, and flee. And then I've already kind of gotten ahead of the story. They flee. And, they say, flee for your life. Do not stop back. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed. And, I can't flee to the hills, he says, for fear the disaster will overtake me and I will die. Look at that little city that's there, And so again, as I said, he goes to this little city called Zoar. And when the sun had risen on the earth, Lot got there, and then the Lord, it says, hailed, overthrew the cities, and sulfur and fire from the Lord came out of the heavens. And this is one of the images that we have of the end times as well, and we just got done reading Revelation, and we some of those images, that way are there. And, but it destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And it says, he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. So it was a vast area that was destroyed. And Lot gets then, he leaves Zoar and he settles in the hill with his two daughters. And because he's afraid to even live in the city of Zoar, it says he lives there with his two daughters. And the daughters then, here we are just with our dad. What are we going to do? We need to, plot. So they plot, and they get their father, Lot, drunk on wine. And the one night the older daughter goes to bed with him. And Lot doesn't, he's not aware of that. The second night they do the same thing. So the younger daughter goes and sleeps with her dad, and they both become pregnant. And this is another sad story of what happens. But the older daughter, she has a son, and she names him Moab, and he becomes the ancestor of the Moabites. The younger daughter has a son and names him Ben-Ami, and he is then the ancestor of the Ammonites. Two different people. And they're the Canaanites. We had the Canaan was one of the sons of one of Noah's offspring there in Egypt. And so here are these two sons that are conceived that way. They become great nations as well. But it's just so many things just don't sit right with our thoughts and with what's going on, or how we think should be. But You know, through it all, God is faithful to those who trust and believe. And that was, you know, the story of Lot and his daughters fleeing and living, being spared that death with all of those, even though Abraham had bargained with God, you know, well, say there's 50, say there's 40, say, you know, I didn't talk about that, but, you know, and so it's just, I mean, and that gives us, I don't know, the ability, the confidence to continue to come to God with our prayers as well, and with our wants and needs. And so we're going to learn a lot more about Abraham and Sarah and in the future days, but, you know, God is definitely working and shaping his chosen people, the Israelites.